Knowledge at Wharton would like to welcome Mark Pauly, who joins us today. And Mark is a Wharton Professor of Healthcare Management, and he's going to talk about a potentially very important aspect of Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, that is kind of a sleeper issue that people haven't paid attention to, but it's potentially really quite important and potentially quite expensive. So I think the title of your new briefing paper on this topic puts it fairly succinctly. You ask, is there a future for employer-sponsored health care? Who knew that there might not be a future? And I think it's a surprising question for a lot of folks. And this has to do with the idea that there may be incentives to employers out there to give up some health insurance plans because of the way that Obamacare affects at least some people in their companies, or at least some companies of a certain size, generally smaller companies.
Right.
Let me leave it to you to spell this out for us a little bit.
So before the passage of the Affordable Care Act, if you were not a poor person eligible for Medicaid, you basically could only get help from the government to get health insurance by getting insurance through your job. And although you may not think of it this way, that actually is potentially a way to provide substantial help, because the fraction of your compensation that you would get as your employer's premium payment would not be subject to taxes. Then, as most of us pay an explicit premium as well, usually it's about a quarter of the total premium, that's also excluded from taxation. And if you have a creative enough employer that's set up a flexible spending account, you can exclude up to $2,500 of spending not covered by insurance from taxation as well. So before the ACA, only people who got insurance through their job could get help for the government from private insurance. What the Affordable Care Act did was set up a system of subsidies related to income, up to 400% of the poverty line income, that a person could get if they got insurance through the exchanges that were set up by the law. And the reaction to that, in part, was to say, well, this may be the end of the world as far as employment-based insurance would go, because especially if you are willing to believe, despite so far, I think, evidence to the contrary, that these exchanges will be terribly efficiently run and offer wonderful choices. Don't get me wrong, there are some good exchanges, but they're more the exception than the rule. But if you thought they'd really be a wonderful thing, maybe a lot of people would say, gee, I'd rather get my insurance through an exchange where perhaps I have more choice than I have at my job. And then some employers said, or even some consultants told them, look, you're now paying, let's say, an average of about $4,000 per worker for insurance. There's a penalty if you're a large employer for not making that payment, but the penalty is only $2,000, $2,000 being less than $4,000. Why not drop insurance coverage and tell your employees to go to exchanges?
Why is the penalty $2,000?
There's an explicit penalty in the law for employers. Well, it was it's called the employer mandate. And the employer mandate says if you're an employer above a certain size, you have to provide insurance to your workers and contribute a certain fraction of their premium. But if you didn't, it's complicated like everything in the law, but roughly speaking, you would be subject to a penalty of $2,000 per worker. But the calculation was, well, $2,000 is less than what I'm paying now. Wouldn't I come out ahead by dropping insurance coverage? What the point that I make in this article is, well, it's not quite so easy. So there are some employers and their workers who would come out ahead. And I guess the key issue here really is not what's in the interest of the employer, but what's in the interest of workers. Can workers on balance be better off by, in effect, taking the money that employers were spending on them for insurance and going to the exchanges? And the answer would be, if you were a worker in especially a small firm with mostly low-wage workers, there would be an advantage. The advantage would be you aren't getting much of a tax break before because your taxable income is not that high. But now, with the same amount of money, you could go to an exchange and say if your income was 200% of the poverty line, which would be about $38,000 for a person, you could get a 50% subsidy. So that's a much bigger break than you were getting before. So the news is that there would be some workers in some firms where there would be an advantage. And if this was a small firm ultimately under 50 workers, although it starts off with a threshold of 100 workers, there would be no penalty for the employer. The only reason, though, why that doesn't necessarily signal a revolution is that the fraction of workers who work in small, homogeneous, low-wage firms who currently get health insurance is actually quite tiny, less than 5% of the overall workforce. So although those people would gain a lot, there aren't a lot of them. And at the other extreme, if you are working in a large firm and you're an upper middle income worker, and most people in that firm are, if that employer canceled in their insurance, then you as workers could go to the exchange, but you would have to pay the full premium without a subsidy, and you wouldn't get the tax break anymore. So you would actually plead with the boss, please don't drop insurance coverage because we'd actually rather get our compensation the way we're currently getting it rather than the way we would have to deal with an exchange.
So from the employer's point of view, let's say I'm a large employer, and I think you said the average premium is $4,000,
yeah.
Even for a large firm. Does that include? Is that like after the tax breaks that I get? From
no, that's
providing
before.
That's before. So it's actually not costing me $4,000. It's costing me something less because of tax advantages.
Yeah. So it depends, of course, what's marginal tax bracket you're in.
Right.
But if you were in a 30% tax bracket, it's costing you $1,200 less than $4,000.
Right. Okay. So then, the employee would not want their employer to do that because it would be almost like a pay cut, wouldn't it?
It would be like a pay cut.
Could you just explain how it would be like a pay cut?
Well, effectively, it is like a pay cut. If you, even though, let's take the simple case where the employer drops insurance but gives you back the money, the $4,000 they were spending, well, you're now going to have to pay $1,200 more in taxes because you got $4,000 more in taxable income. You go to the exchange, you say, where's my subsidy? They say, sorry, you earned too much to be eligible for a subsidy. You get zero subsidy. You're out $12,000. And at least in my simple example, the employer was neutral because they just transferred the money from paying for benefits to cash compensation.
But you're out $1,200 or $1,200?
$1,200. Yeah, $1,200.
Yeah.
You're out $1,200 by losing the tax break. So that's, I guess that's a lose-lose proposition.
But it doesn't take take account of the idea that an employer, not saying they would, but in theory they could say, I'm not providing insurance, which would be like a pay cut. Oh, and I'm not giving you the $4,000.
Yeah, well, they could of course say, I'm not giving you the money either. But then you'd wonder, that would be like a pay cut, and you'd wonder, you're kind of a sorry excuse for a capitalist because you must have been overpaying me in the first place.
Right.
If I will continue to work for you after this big pay cut.
Because now you're less competitive.
Yeah,
workers
right.
want to work someplace else. Yeah.
We usually assume, and it's probably easier to assume in the current labor market than in the labor market that prevailed in 2010 when the ACA was passed. But we usually assume labor markets are pretty competitive. Workers are not being overpaid, but if their compensation takes a big hit, the employer that does that is actually going to lose rather than win because the workers will no longer want to work there.
So whether your pay is cut or your health care benefits are cut, it feels the same to the worker.
It feels the same. And really that's kind of the main economic message here, that employers don't give you health insurance. They just either pay you in the form of cash or in the form of benefits. And one advantage, as I started off by saying, of getting paid in the form of benefits is that's something I get a tax break for, whereas if I get paid as cash, I have to pay tax on it.
As does the employer.
As does the employer for the Social Security part, yeah.
So the big split here seems to be bigger companies and smaller companies.
Yeah.
And I think you're saying that the percentage of smaller companies doesn't add up to a very big percentage.
Yeah,
overall.
if that's right, or at least if you look at the fraction of people who were getting private health insurance through their job, which was more than 90% of all people getting private health insurance, the great bulk of those people are not working in small, homogeneous, low-wage firms. They're working in large firms that either have high average wages, which was the story I was telling a few minutes ago, or even if, as in many large firms, there are some low-wage workers, the great bulk of the workers are not low-wage. So if the firm cancels the whole deal, it's going to do more harm to the larger number of high-wage workers than it's going to benefit the small number of low-wage workers. So, and then if you add on top of that the fact that there's this $2,000 penalty, it would seem like a money-losing proposition all around for a large firm to contemplate dropping health benefits.
So there's another intriguing line in your brief, which says that there could be some incentive for some large companies to think about creating a separate company for lower wage workers in order to eliminate some health care insurance. So,
yeah. So my position on this, my econometrics professor told me when you forecast the future, never attach a date if you present a number. But I'll put a date here. So my view is that in the short run, let's say over the next 5 years, I don't see a massive reduction in the provision of health insurance by employers, just for the reasons I mentioned, that the great bulk of workers now getting health insurance through their jobs are in these large heterogeneous firms, that there isn't going to be a net gain from dropping coverage. But
heterogeneous meaning?
Meaning there's some low-wage workers, but a lot of high-wage workers. With enough time and with enough ingenuity on the part of Americans, which we definitely have an adequate amount of, a large firm could see, although it might not be politically correct, how to make it possible for their low-wage workers to get this juicy tax subsidy that they could get in exchange. What they would have to do, at least the most straightforward way, would be to reconfigure the way the firm is organized, kind of spin off the tasks that are performed by low-wage workers into a firm hiring only low-wage people, and preferably even still a small firm. And then there wouldn't be a penalty, and those workers could potentially claim a fairly hefty tax break. My assumption is that it would take a while for that change to happen, but I guess it could eventually happen, because in some ways saying, well, if you're a low-wage worker who worked for a small firm, or if you were a self-employed low-wage person, right now you're eligible for this quite generous subsidy, but if you're the janitor at Microsoft, you're not eligible for this subsidy. That's sort of intrinsically unstable in addition to being unfair.
Are there any industries where where the cleavage between the two groups might be more natural? And
yeah, well, that's a good question.
I don't know.
I think the answer is if it's possible to separate out the low-wage workers into a separate entity with separate management and still have production take place efficiently, that would be an industry where that would happen. Now, thinking of the industry I work in, which is the higher education industry, we have low-wage workers here, administrative staff, and so forth, and they're literally our partners. It would be hard for me to think of handing over my calendar planning or preparation of materials for my classes to somebody who works for a separate company other than the University of Pennsylvania. So I don't see Penn actually engaging in this spinning off low-wage workers for the bulk of what people do here. I mean, we actually have already, of course, spun off things like campus security and some of the food services to other firms, so that would be possible.
What about something like a mass manufacturing firm, an assembly line operation, right, where you've got thousands of workers doing that, and then a smaller management?
Yeah, well, again, I think it comes back to, can you separately carve out the tasks? In a manufacturing firm, a lot of the low-wage workers are just, because their seniority, they're just workers who haven't been there as long. And it would be kind of hard to say we'll have a separate firm for the starting workers and then for the permanent workers. Although, here at the university we do have adjuncts, and you could imagine spinning them off into a separate firm. But it doesn't seem, as I think about the question in general, I think there's a reason why firms are heterogeneous, why they employ high-wage and low-wage workers, because it's more efficient to manage them collectively rather than managing them separately. But if there's enough of a carrot dangled in front of people to switch the method of organization, well, somebody's always on the margin. Somebody might do it. But I guess I'm programmed to say, but that doesn't sound like a good idea for society, because you are, in effect, subsidizing an inefficient way of organizing production. If it really was more efficient to have workers, high and low wage, as part of the same firm.
What haven't we covered on this that would be important for viewers to know about?
Well, there is a kind of current way to make it advantageous for low-wage workers to be spun out or to be separated, and that is, and there's a considerable debate about this, the law penalizes firms when they don't provide health insurance to full-time workers, but not when they don't provide health insurance to part-time workers. So this has been a big debate, and one of the I believe, adverse incentives present in the law is to say to an employer, look, if you can split your work into twice as many part-time workers instead of full-time workers, and if they are also low wage, that's important. If they're low wage anyway, but you can split them into part-time workers, then those part-time workers, there's no penalty for sending them off to the exchange. Now I'm back again on my sermonette about how that doesn't sound like a good way to organize production, because usually it doesn't make as much sense to have a lot of part-time workers as a smaller number of full-time workers if you're producing things in ordinary kind of production setting. Although, of course, we know for some things like fast food and things like that, it may not be so inefficient.
And some companies are already doing that.
See,
They're
but-
already limiting hours. So
Yeah,
that,
but some companies are saying, and they're probably right, that this incentive will cause us to emphasize part-time work more than full-time work. There's no intrinsic merit to full-time or part-time work, but having the reason why you choose to employ people as part-timers is because of this subsidy is not a good reason from a point of view of overall efficiency.
Well, thank you for coming in and chatting with
Okay,
us.
sure. All right.